Welcome, everyone, to Our Whole Lives Taking Flight. And today we will be discussing May is Sex Ed for All Month. My name is Reverend Amy Johnson. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as the Minister of Sexuality and Justice, Sexuality Education and Justice for the United Church of Christ. I am delighted that you are here with us today, and we are a little bit overflowing this morning, actually, because today is May 1st, 2024. And the United Methodist Church this morning, we just got word, struck down their 40-year ban on gay clergy and on some of the verbiage in their book of discipline about Christianity and homosexuality being incompatible. That is gone now from the book of discipline. And we just found that out when we were planning this and talking ahead of time here. So we are just amazed and delighted that that has finally occurred. And so thank you for your patience and your grace while I made me a little just flabbergasted and excited this morning. Spirit is moving, and we are here today with some amazing guests. I want to just mention that Melanie Davis, I believe, is on a flight right now, and she is not able to join us today. And we have the amazing Reverend Tandy Rogers and Reverend Naomi Washington Leapheart with us. I'm going to let them have a minute and introduce themselves. So Tandy, will you chat with us a little bit about who you are?
Sure. I am a longtime Our Whole Lives evangelist. I'm now a national trainer. That's like, I can take that off my bucket list, like for reals. Before that, and this is the reason I'm an evangelist. I worked for the Unitarian Universalist Association, mostly out in the field, and I have watched how Our Whole Lives has transformed congregations, but also as a mom, I have seen firsthand how it has literally saved lives of people who call me mom. And so anything Owl wants me to do, I will do it.
Thank you, Tandy. We have proclaimed Tandy our Chief Evangelical Officer of Our Whole Lives, and that is a sincere voluntary title that she has accepted, and we appreciate you being here today. Naomi, can you talk to us a little bit about who you are and why you're here?
Yes, I am Naomi Washington Leapheart. I use she, her pronouns. I am a new trainer for the Our Whole Lives program. And so I'm excited to be the new evangelist for OWL. I am a minister with the United Church of Christ and the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. And in my day job, I'm a political strategist and professor. And so I'm excited to think about sexuality education from many different perspectives, from the perspective as a person of faith, as a Christian minister, but also as a person working in the midst of politics right now. And I can see the political need for a program like OWL. So excited to be here today.
So here we are. I'm going to give you a couple logistics like I always do. Laura has a question in the chat, but if you'd be willing to just say who you are and where you're from, that'd be great. If you have a question during our time together, if you can please use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen on this webinar platform of Zoom. That helps us track those better than trying to keep an eye on the chat. And we'll have some resources for you as we go along. And I think we should just dive right in here. Does that sound all right? Tandy has came up with some really beautiful questions for Naomi. And Naomi is as she said, on the SIECUS board and providing a faith perspective for them. And so those are some things we want to focus on and how we can partner together with this initiative of May is Sex Ed for All. Like, what does all mean and all those kind of things. So Tandy, go right ahead with your questions.
One of my core questions, thank you, Amy. One of my core questions I always ask, particularly a religious leader, is what is your holy why? Why do you do this work?
Thanks, Sandy, for this question. I mean, it's always so important to be grounded, right, in this sense of purpose and why. I grew up in a Christian environment that ignored bodies, that vilified bodies, The message that I absorbed was basically that my body was an impediment to my faith, that trusting my bodily instinct, that exercising my bodily autonomy would be a hindrance to discipleship, to following Jesus. And so the crux of my why is that I want to redeem the body as the very instrument that God uses to get close to humanity, right? I live in an incarnational faith, which requires bodies to grow. And so I want to be a part of that. And OWL is designed to get us back into our bodies, to see our bodies as redeemed, as holy, and as instruments, not just of God's use, right? Because that's the other thing. It was like my body is only here to be used by God, but also instruments of pleasure and instruments of agency, right? Instruments of life. So my why is very closely connected to some of the um, contradictions that I absorbed in my childhood faith community about my body.
I just want to jump in here and say I love that you named the pleasure piece, Naomi, because I think that sometimes, well, I know that many times people in churches and faith leaders are afraid of that word, or they are very judgmental about that word. And they are concerned. I hear many times about people are concerned that if we focus on pleasure and letting people know about the pleasures of the body, that that will somehow make them go have sexual activity with other people, or that is somehow unholy or unsacred. And I think that one of the things that really is ignored when we subscribe in any way to that narrative is that if someone, I mean, just aside from just the general theology of the body is good, right? Like that, and reclaiming that, and knowing what we like, knowing what feels good to us, knowing whether that's a smell or a sight or a way of being touched or anything like that, or what we like to hear, any of those things. When we are aware of that and we are aware of what our bodies enjoy and don't enjoy, then we can have much more informed conversations around consent. And that is something that gets really lost in this conversation. And it's a huge part. It's a huge part of consent, of people, particularly, I think, people who identify as women in our country, and in our culture, who are taught and socialized to put our wants and needs on the back burner, to be able to know and to be, like you said, incarnate and human and whole, and know what our bodies enjoy and don't enjoy, and be able to state that. That's huge. It's just huge.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason I joined the SIECUS board was to introduce a kind of prophetic imagination to the ways we talk about sexuality education. This is not just a political matter, it's a spiritual matter. And so I want to bring my network, to the experience I have in religious circles, to an organization like SIECUS, which is focused on policy change, is focused on comprehensive sex ed for all. And so you're absolutely right. It's the both and.
I just want to add very concisely, God wants to be savored.
Mm,
That's
mm, mm. This should be, spirituality should be a sensual experience in that it taps into all of our senses, right? And so many of us have approached spirituality merely from a cognitive or intellectual space. And, you know, what's interesting is about the childhood community I grew up in, while we were taught from a dogmatic perspective that our bodies were problematic, worship was a sensual and sensory experience, right? We used our bodies to praise God. So there was this disconnect, right? That on the one hand, I'm making my whole body available in the worship moment, right? I feel deeply the intimacy of worship, um, while condemning my body 6 days out of the week, right? When I'm not in worship, right? It was just, who can live with those tensions and who can live with those contradictions?
I just want to lift up here. I was saying to these two beautiful humans, well, actually three, because our tech person is on here as well, earlier, that we had our Pacific Northwest Conference, United Church of Christ annual meeting this past weekend. And we had some amazing preaching and we had some amazing worship that was not centered around white worship at all. It was centered around Samoan churches that joined our conference, and it was centered around Black leadership. So we were in our bodies, right? We were experiencing that in ways that many times, not always, but many times in the United Church of Christ, it is a very heady experience. And Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown, who was giving the message on Sunday morning, was talking about the scripture where we talk about, we all are different parts of the body of Christ. And she said sometimes in the UCC, it feels like we're one giant head, an arm, and a couple of toes. And I just thought that was really, a spectacular image, because there is a disconnect. And sometimes it's even, in some places, like there's even the disconnect of not even having that embodied worship to lean on and lean into. So I'm going to stop there and let Tandy ask more questions.
I can say so much about that. Have our version of that. Oh my Lord. And that's what I mean about OWL being one of the saving strategies for our traditions. And it helps get out of the head entirely and into the whole, and into a whole structure, not just individual, but interconnected. Oh, I could go on. I love it so much. Naomi, when I read your your bio, I get so excited because there's words like politics and research and religion and sexuality and strategy. These are some of my favorite words. And then you put them all together and I'm like, oh. So from all that goodness, what do you want religious leaders to know about specifically? What do you want them to know and do right now, specifically in service of sexuality liberation?
Yeah, I mean, so thank you for that question. And you know, I do think that the Christian church anyway has limited our strategy to articulating liberatory theologies of sexuality. So we say God loves all, and all means all, and y'all means all, and we say love wins, and these messages are important and they are resonant, but they are limited because they don't get at the scope of what we're dealing with politically. Um, I want religious leaders to know how central, and Amy referred to it a few minutes ago, how central misogyny is to building an authoritarian regime. None of this works without a fundamental contempt for bodies, and particularly women's bodies, and I would add to that queer and trans bodies, right? And so we need strategies that go beyond the four walls of our religious communities, of the four walls of our houses of worship. We need arguments that are grounded in political analysis. We need to identify those who are, I'm going to say, anti-comprehensive sexuality education. We need to know their names. We need to know where they hang out. We need to know who they're in bed with politically, right? We need to follow the money. Who is funding the anti-gender, anti-woman, anti-queer, anti-trans campaigns that are building momentum and gaining success in many states around the country. We don't have that kind of sophisticated read of the landscape because we think that once we become theologically transformed, that's all there is to it. We can just get people to change their minds about God and change their minds about the Bible, then we're done. But we're up against a formidable opponent that has taken, sure, grounded by theological commitments that we do not share, grounded by interpretations of the Bible that we do not share, but also grounded by the power conferred to those institutions, those individuals, by money and by kind of state capturing positions within state governments that allow them to move forward legislation that are anti-sexuality education. So, using resource organizations like SIECUS that publishes maps and other kinds of infographics that are easy for us to understand what's going on in our state. Organizations like Political Research Associates, where I hang my hat in a full-time way, that's doing research around what the far right is doing. We need to be versed, right? We don't need to leave that up to political pundits. We need to be versed in these kinds of political analyses.
So
Yeah,
once
we
we
do.
know where they hang out, though, what do we do?
Well, I mean, at least once we know our target and we know their patterns and we know their messaging, we can then strategize accordingly. For example, one of the things that I do as part of my organizational full-time work is opposition research that actually puts me in the room with far-right leaders. Now, again, this is not work for everybody to do, but nevertheless, right? And so once I get in the room and I understand their strategy, I mean, even if I don't agree with it, I got to respect the power of their strategy. Then I can come back to my drawing board and say, here's the strategy we're going to use to confront and confuse and interrupt that strategy, right? So it's all about strategy design and not just reacting, right,
Thank you
to
for
the latest
saying that.
headline. Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important I mean, we can lone wolf it, but it isn't advisable, right? I think where we need to do our due diligence is to create these partnerships like we're talking about today, right? And to work together and to be very strategic and very thoughtful about how to interrupt and disrupt this kind of thing. These groups, y'all, I mean, it's sometimes when I talk about this and hear people talk about this, I know that we sound like conspiracy theorists sometimes, but it's true. It's like really true. These are very well-funded groups. There's a whole thing I subscribe to and occasionally read because some days I'm like, I can't read that today. Which is Ascend, and it's one of these sexual risk avoidance groups. And their whole thing is like, they don't even think that youth should think about sexuality because that is it's blaming people for their, biology and developmental arc of humanness. And that if you think about it, then you're going to do it kind of thing. And they're very anti-trans. They have these people with degrees and medical degrees that have written books that talk about a kind of gender science that is, I don't know actually how they can call it science, really. So there's different they're very well funded. And there are groups that are the Dominion theology, right, of taking over education and government and all of this kind of thing that is a Christian nationalist kind of viewpoint. So there is a lot at stake. And sexuality education is on the chopping block. And SIECUS did an amazing legislative landscape webinar, I think it was last month, talking about the kinds of bills that are being proposed and that sound good on the surface, but the dangers of them. And for us to be able to think, like you said, Naomi, strategically, and to consider, well, maybe I think that's a good restriction to put online, but I'm not thinking about all of the kids and youth in places where there is no access to any sexuality education, to any accurate information about gender, to anything other than this sexual risk avoidance kind of stuff, and the kind of shaming, misogynistic, abstinence only education that is out there. And that's all they have access to, unless they can go online and go on Advocates for Youth or go on SIECUS or Find Owl or any of those kind of things. So I'm going to stop preaching right now, but I just wanted to validate that very strongly.
And you kind of alluded to it now, but I'm wondering, okay, so OWL is often mostly taught in congregations.
Mm-hmm.
How can we mobilize congregations to do, like, if you could mobilize congregations to do one thing to make big impact, Naomi, what would it be?
I think what was underneath what you were saying, I think we need to build partnerships beyond the congregation. The congregation is one sort of organism in the coalition that we actually need to have in order to be successful. So if you already are OWL trained, for example, or OWL, you already love OWL and you've implemented OWL in your congregational community, what would it mean to host as a trusted site in a community and OWL training for people beyond the congregation, right? We need to leverage the spiritual and moral authority that we still have. I mean, it's dwindling, let me say. But we still can leverage the spiritual and moral authority we have to open up the conversation about sexuality education for people beyond ourselves. There are gender justice organizations in local communities, and there are academics who research misogyny and patriarchy, right? Think outside the box about the people who are ideologically aligned, but who are not yet mobilized into coalition, and start the coalition, right? What would it mean to have a monthly strategy table with the congregation, but also the organizations in the community, the legislators, the lawmakers who are allied, right? What would it mean to talk across these silos and to build collective strategy together and be moving in lockstep? I mean, we might not agree on all the things, but if we can agree that comprehensive sexuality education is a human right, we can build some strategy around that agreement, right? So I think I want to mobilize congregations to think broadly about who our allies and comrades are in this fight towards sexuality liberation. There are some usual suspects, but we also need to be mobilizing. Listen, the far right is mobilizing, as you said, Tandy and Amy. They're doctors. They're mobilizing their scientists to publish what I would call pseudo-authoritative materials, right? Why can't we mobilize our doctors and our scientists, right, to work in tandem with our religious leaders and our politicians, right? Our tables are too narrow, and congregations can be convening places for a broad front that we need to defeat the formidable opponent that's before us.
I can hear my grandmother saying, don't forget about the food. So I am like a slow and long kind of organizer. And my grandmother taught me that do not have an important conversation unless there is food involved.
Mm-hmm.
And so I call on our congregations to be, you said, a table, to set like a literal table of food, gather people for conversations where we ask, what is your holy why? Tell me about like the spiritual questions, which we do so well, those spiritual questions, so that we know each other. So when the rubber hits the road and we need each other to do something, we already know each other, right? We've done, that's the work of the holy as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to say, like, I know that there are some, like you're saying, Naomi, like we need to coalesce, right? Because I know there's this research, there's a whole bunch of, like, some of our original Our Whole Lives authors did this amazing research about 30 years of comprehensive sexuality education. And like, what have we learned, right? And there's 30 years of research, right? And then I think about, I do a little bit of work outside of the UCC. I'm on faculty of an organization out here in Seattle called Great Conversations, and we do puberty education for parents and kids to come to together. And one of the people who was one of the founders of that program was an adolescent medical doc. He's since retired, but he used to tell our staff, right? He used to say, you know, the adolescent, like the national adolescent medicine groups do not any longer research whether or not teaching kids about sex and sexuality is going to make them have sex sooner, because we definitively know that is not true. And so we do not waste our research dollars researching that anymore because we don't need to. We know it's not true. And yet, right? And yet, there are well-funded, well-organized groups who are just saying the opposite of that. It's not research-based, but they're saying it, and people are believing it. So, so how do we come together? How do we set that table, as you said, Tandy, and say, and live out our faith, which is y'all come. And especially in the United Church of Christ, when we say that, we got to be prepared for y'all to come, right? Like there may be some dissenting voices at the table, but if we set it and are willing to have conversations and to organize together and to I think when we talk about our holy why, we're not going to be that far off, even if we're on either end of what we want to happen politically. I think those holy whys are going to coalesce and bring us common ground.
The holy wise, but then also, maybe this is a bad idea, but what's bubbling up for me is I also want to know what's the tug on people's heart. Like, I want to know, like, what are you afraid of? Also, there's like this compassion of there's so much fear out there. I want to know what my neighbor worries about. And if it's something that I can take like off their shoulders, I will do it. If there's something that we can work together on, let's talk about that too. I'm ready for some hard conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that I've learned in my work around political strategy and movement building and organizing is it's a dangerous move to completely disregard and dismiss someone's fears, right? That that politics grounded by fear um are that's what our opponents are relying on, right? And we've got to be courageous enough to take the fears head on, to hear them articulated. We might have to, we might need a minute after we hear that, but we need to hear it. Because guess what? Far right folks are willing to sit and listen to people express their concerns and fears and are willing to address them head on, right? And I think that we've, as a general whole, been too dismissive of and disregard. I'm talking about myself. I have been too dismissive of people's fears, but fear is a strong, strong motivator. And if a person knows they can come to me with their fear, they might be willing to sit with me as we reason together to get to the other side of that fear, right? But if I'm dismissing it wholesale, there's a community waiting for them on the far right.
I'm reminded of I've told this story a number of times, but several years ago, I was just so fortunate to be involved in some partnership work with the Church of Sweden and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Tanzania. And we went to do an Our Whole Lives training in Tanzania, and we learned so much. So we went back, we did it way different, but the first time we're there. And like the Associate Secretary General of the ELCT is in the training, and we're doing our thing, and we're trusting the process of our whole lives training. And people are in their collars and they're sitting there, and they're very much like, what the heck are these people doing here, and these from other countries telling us what to do and everything. And partway through the training, you could like see this light bulb go off in his head, this Associate Secretary General. And he said, oh my gosh, how can we expect our young people to make good decisions if we don't give them the information they need to make those decisions? So there was enough at that point, enough conversation and group cohesion, and we had had conversations and been willing to hear all of everybody's fears and what they were concerned about and everything, that there was space enough for that to bubble up. And it was just a pivotal turning point in that space. And I think that we have a lot of that here in our culture as well.
We've been talking about hard conversations and the almost coalitions and some actual coalitions of gathering people around these issues of sexuality liberation. The curriculum itself, lifespan, so many ways for it to go out into the community, out beyond our congregations. I'm wondering if you have any ideas, Naomi, as to where else that how it could live outside our walls of congregations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what there are partner organizations or organizations that we should be in partnership with. I'm thinking about organizations that are coming alongside parents for the first time. Because part of it is I think of OWL, and I think of comprehensive sexuality education as an invitation to a lifestyle. I know lifestyle has been weaponized in so many ways, and as a queer person, I hesitate to use the word, but I really do think of this as a particular ethic, a way of being in the world, a way of thinking about self and others, a way of thinking about pleasure and body, and organizations that are trying to support and accompany parents, young parents, for example. I mean, this is thinking way outside the box. Like, how can parents begin to think about sexuality education from the beginning, right? We often only occurs to folks to be interested in sexuality education when there is a punishment or a restriction that we're trying to hand down to the next generation. But what if we thought about, just like you're accompanying your child in literacies, other kinds of literacy, right? Sexuality literacy is one of them, right? We we need to be involved, right? What if we partnered, say, with libraries, for example, that have children's books, right? And they're already trying to get children to think of themselves on the page, to see their experiences on the page, reflected on the page. There are some great resources that I've been exposed to through OWL, right? For children, right? And libraries, these bastions of kind of literacy and intellectual development, can also be a site for introducing children in age-appropriate ways to the kinds of sexuality values that they need to internalize, right? So that's what I mean by thinking outside of the box. Like, we are always being educated around sexuality. The question is that education intentional? And to what degree can we influence that process, right? But we need to know that every institution that a person interacts with might be teaching them something about sexuality and their bodies. So we need to think of ourselves as intervening in all of the places where sexuality education is happening, not just in schools, although schools is a big deal. And I've learned a lot about the schools advocacy that we need to do through the work at SIECUS, but also other places, right? And so, that's why I think that religious organizations are in prime position as community institutions to know what's going on in terms of the landscape of sexuality education broadly in their communities, and then seek to intervene whenever we can.
I just love that so much. It's just so much. I mean, that whole thing about we're always learning about sexuality. I mean, I talk to parents about that all the time. And one of the primary tenets of our whole lives is that parents are the primary sexuality educators for their children. So I'm just going to pop in the link or the chat, a link to our parents and caregivers of sexuality educators, free download curriculum, small group ministry thing. There's a UU version as well. But whether we're talking about it or not, we're educating our kids. And if we're not talking about it intentionally, then we're giving them the message that it's not okay to talk about. And that's a big message, right? And I think that it's so important for us to consider that and to be aware of how we are and aren't talking about it, and that there are that having conversations, and parents are hungry. They are hungry and thirsty for how to talk to kids about it. And to do it, I mean, there's a ton of information out there about talking to your kids about sexual assault, right? And sexual abuse. And so sometimes parents will say, oh yes, we've had all the safety talks. So basically what they've done is scare the bejesus out of their kids, right? About their bodies and sexuality, rather than, like you were saying, Naomi, like having an ethic of bodies are awesome. Bodily autonomy is important. What does that mean? Like, do you make your kids kiss and hug, Uncle Fred and Grandma Grace, like, do you make them do that? Do you tickle them even when they don't, do you, there are things that we need to look at in terms of that as well.
Okay, you were talking about parents. I want to put a plug in for grandparents because I'm a grandparent now. And, I'm fierce for my kids, but I think of like my political, like, don't piss off a grandma when it comes to their right. No. But I think of like, oh my gosh, what could OWL look like if it were we've talked about OWL in assisted living, and those kind of communities, but not just for the adults, which yes, please, that's really important too, but as a way to advocate and be that grandparent that is there for your grandkids. Because my grandkids are already starting. I know I'm going to be the grandma that answers those questions that, the parents are like, oh my God, please go ask your grandma, kind of grandma, which that's a badge of honor. I think of coaches in middle school and high school as also an untapped who goes and asks hard questions, right? Or gets messages of how is your body, right? Fraternities and sororities. Okay, anybody out there that wants to talk about a strategy for getting OWL into sororities or fraternities, please call me as the volunteer chief strategy officer for OWL. Private schools, particularly tribal schools. When I was a teacher at the tribal school locally, we got, it wasn't OWL back then, it was about your sexuality, but we got it in and it was amazing. Community colleges. And they've added libraries. So thank you for that. And I'm going to, as soon as we're off this call, I'm going to call an activist librarian I know and start getting in cahoots. Okay, go ahead.
I want to, there was a question in Q&A that alluded to the senior living organizations. And I think that you mentioned that too, Tandy. And I think that that's a really an important piece. And what I see is not only like, for some groups, I mean, our Whole Lives for Older Adults has gotten rave reviews from churches and groups that have used it. Some places are going to be like, we don't need that, that's fine. But what they do need is how to be a grandparent, how to be a grandparent to kids. Sometimes they're parenting their children's children, right? They're grandparenting, but also around gender, especially like understanding what it means to be non-binary, understanding the fluidity of gender, understanding what terms mean, all those kinds of things. And I know so many people who are fiercely protective of their grandchildren around gender. That's one of the reasons that they are open to the conversation and that they are willing to hear and change thoughts and feelings and actions is because their grandkid needs their love and support. So there are lots of ways that we can partner with lots of organizations. I'm like, who do I need to talk to get a monthly strategy table going nationally, and then have some like regional chapters? I'm thinking that way. So
That's what we need. We need coalition tables, right? We got some medical professionals around the table. We've got some sexuality educators around the table. We've got some religious leaders who can contextualize around spirituality and the values therein. We've got young people around the table who can be like, no, that messaging is not going to work for my age demographic, right? So often the conversation around sexuality education is limited to just a few stakeholders. And I think this is part of the issue. We need tables that are intentionally designed to welcome a variety of stakeholders so that we know where the gaps are, we know where we're missing in terms of messaging, we know what's resonant and what's not. And so, yeah, build that table, right? I see Tandy plotting and planning.
Oh, watch out when you get the three of us together. It's a good thing.
And I think that the other thing is too, donors. I'm learning a lot about donor mobilization and donor organizing. How do we organize the money, right? Because winning is not just about organizing power, it's also about organizing resources, right?
Yes.
There are people who would give to the sustainability of a kind of table coalition that you're talking about. And so how do donors or people with wealth or people with philanthropic interests, how are they organized and educated about the need for this? And then I think politicians need to be organized too, right? There are what would it mean for us to think state by state, region by region, municipality by municipality? Let me get my city council people in the room. Let me go and speak at the city council meeting about this tool that's available. Or let me go and talk to my school board members, right, about this, right? So, folks are put in these positions to represent us, and we assume that they will do what they need to do to learn all they need to learn around the issues. No. One of the things I've learned is that the opposition is so good at re-educating persons in power for their own agenda, right? And so we have access to these power brokers as well. We can educate or re-educate them as well. So what would it mean to have an owl presentation for lawmakers in my community? Right?
I volunteered ad nauseum for that. I'll drop everything to go.
Let's go. Let's do it.
I think as you're talking, Naomi, I'm thinking like we get this table together, right? And so how many people are going to be watching this afterwards and going, did they do it yet? So there's a little accountability in there, which is good. But also I'm like, so then we need advocacy training, right? Like we need to train people how to go advocate, how to talk to your local people, your state people, and how to talk to them. Even if, because I know in my state, I have some very supportive legislators. There's still issues, right? Like, how do we talk about what's next? What do we need to do to solidify this? I remember, so I live in Washington State, and there was a big campaign a few years ago for something called R90, which did codify comprehensive, inclusive sexuality education. Like so many things, it's an unfunded mandate. And so there are many school districts that are not following it. And as a follow-up conversation last year, I spoke to one of the sponsors, who's one of my state senator, and she said one of the things they had to do after our 90 passed was to go in and change the law so that when school superintendents take their oath of office, they have to agree to follow the law. So it's that kind of precision, like we're seeing, you've seen that kind of precision in legislation around reproductive justice, right? And around removing rights for access to pregnancy termination and abortion and care and all those kind of things. We've seen that kind of precision in gender affirming care in legislation that's trying to remove that and legislate people out of existence and take all their rights away. We've seen that kind of precision. And so there's this like counter precision initiative going on where I know like about a year and a half ago, our governor and the legislators, they actually asked to come to our local church because they knew that this UCC church in my town was open to this and they wanted a faith voice. So we had a bunch of clergy there from different interfaith. We had rabbi also and some Muslim leaders as well. And we had a whole bunch of faith leaders in the room as they were announcing those precisely worded kinds of legislation to protect the reproductive health rights in our state, the access rights, to protect people who came from other states so that we would know we will not give information to Texas about who came here for gender affirming care or for reproductive health or anything else. So they had to do these really precise kinds of things, and also about when hospitals merge, because there's a very, there's a religious component to that as well sometimes with Catholicism and merging hospitals and then taking away certain types of contraceptive availability and the right to have an abortion or gender affirming care. Sometimes those things go away and there's only access to this one hospital within 100 miles in a rural area. So all those kinds of legislative things were announced at our church, which was really kind of fun and awesome. And then they all passed. So I got to go see the governor sign them. So that was like one kind of coalition that came together, but it still needed to happen, even in a state where the political climate is favorable for the things that we're talking about. So just because we live somewhere like Washington or Oregon or California or Massachusetts or, that doesn't mean we don't have work to do. That was my long-winded way of making that point.
When you answered my last question, that was about partners. Who do we partner with? And now I've got my long list, and we've got a strategy of gathering regional tables. So
Yes,
got my.
I want to wrap us up here with a couple things. Naomi, when you started out, you used the term prophetic imagination. And I just want to lift that up and like empower everyone on this call and everyone who's watching afterwards to embody prophetic imagination of how you can do more and have more sacred tables and more sacred conversations around these topics, because as I say all the time, at its heart, at its core, our whole lives is about dismantling shame and stigma around bodies and relationships. And we know that shame and stigma can be fatal. So this is life-giving and life-saving work. And we're so grateful that you're in it with us. Do you have any wrap-up comments you would like to make or something you'd like to lift up as we close out this webinar today?
Well, I was trying to find the link. We are going to be in conversation with SIECUS. SIECUS is the organization that I'm on the board of, and SIECUS's mission is to create a world where comprehensive inclusive sexuality education is available for all, regardless of identity, regardless of geography, regardless of sexuality. And so we have partnered, Our Whole Lives has partnered with SIECUS to do a webinar. And I'm trying to find I'm going to put the link in the chat.
I'm looking too. I know when it is.
Well, at least we can tell them when it is.
Yeah. Oh, okay. On the link. Hang on. I can put it in there.
Okay.
It's next Tuesday evening. And it is at 7 Eastern. So here's the link right here. It's at 7 Eastern, and we'll put this on when we post this on YouTube, we'll put the link there if anybody's looking for it before next Tuesday. Tuesday, May 7th at 7 o'clock Eastern. You would get the link to join once you register. So that is the info that we have, and we're excited. Melanie Davis and myself and Naomi will be on having a conversation somewhat similar to this, but with SIECUS's list of folks. And there are already, if you go to at United Church of Christ or at United Church on some social media, you can find the event information, or SIECUS has, I don't know if it's on there yet, but I know SIECUS has started to do a lot of PR. So there's some Instagram PR, and there's some Twitter, or I mean X, sorry, and there's Facebook, and there's emails going out. So so if you see those come across your inbox or your social media, please share that widely. We'd love to have a large audience and get this message out as much as possible. Somebody, I'm not going to say who it was, did put in the chat to us as hosts about being a sorority alum, or I think it's a sorority alum. And
Yes.
Tandy was asking if you would share your contact
Already
information
connected.
with us and the host, and then she will follow up with you. So if you're able to do that, that would be great. Oh, thanks. Naomi's got the Instagram feed right there. Awesome.
I found it. Yes.
Yeah, so it's a nice little graphic with some awesome photos, and we're excited for that, and we're excited for this this partnership, and we're excited that we have these two amazing strategists as our whole lives trainers now, and the exciting work we can do. I am again, open invitation to present to legislatures around our whole lives, or even small groups. So so there you go. We are going to wrap this up, y'all. Thank you again for your commitment to our whole lives, for your ongoing support of us as we gather voices together and do these webinars, for all the facilitating you do, and the training that you do, and the informal conversations that you have, and the tables that you're setting and that you will continue to set. We are grateful for you. June 6th will be, no, June 5th. June 5th will be our next webinar, and we will have author Jamie Brucehoff on, and she wrote a book called Raising Kids Beyond the Binary. And she is a, oh, thank you, Laura. There's the registration link in the chat. And she wrote this book about her daughter and her journey in the Lutheran Church, and just church settings and beyond, and doing so much advocacy for kids who are beyond the binary. So we invite you into that conversation on June 5th. Thank you so much, everyone. I wish you a beautiful day celebrating the United Methodist Church and all the ways that we bring the expansive love of our Creator into the world. Peace be with you.
Peace. Thank you.